All right, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson and I'll be moderating today's event. So I'd like to thank you for joining us for our SMA Stratcom Academic Alliance speaker session entitled U.S. Nuclear Policy from the Cold War to 2020, a comparative analysis of nuclear posture reviews. I'd also like to thank today's speaker, Dr. Anna Peczali, for taking the time to present today. So before we begin, I just have a few quick housekeeping items. So we'll be having a virtual Q&A session after the brief. Throughout the brief or during the Q&A, just feel free to submit your questions via the live event Q&A chat. It's the chat icon and it has two overlapping speech bubbles. One has a question mark. Also be sure to type in your name and affiliation before your question, or if you'd prefer for your name not to be recorded, you can submit your question anonymously. You can also vote on which questions you'd like to be addressed most by hitting the like button next to the question. So now I'm going to turn the floor over briefly to Ms. Julie McNally from the U.S. Stratcom Academic Alliance to provide today's introduction. So Julie, over to you.
Good afternoon and welcome to another SMA Stratcom Academic Alliance speaker session. The purpose of the Alliance is to develop an academic community of interest focused on research and analysis of deterrence, assurance, and associated strategic level security themes in a rapidly changing multi-domain global threat environment. This speaker series is part of how Academic Alliance encourages collaboration among universities, think tanks, the labs, and DoD. Today we welcome Dr. Anna Peczali, a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Labs. She is also an affiliate at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University and an adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and Defense Studies at the National University of Public Service in Budapest, Hungary. She earned her PhD in International Relations from Corvinus University of Budapest. Her research focuses on U.S. nuclear planning, in particular the challenges, the changes and continuities in U.S. nuclear strategy since the end of the Cold War. Welcome, Dr. Peczali, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction. I'm really happy to be here today, and I'm very excited to get some feedback and questions on this research. First, I will also start with a housekeeping disclaimer that everything I say here is really kind of a reflection on my academic research that I have done mostly for my PhD thesis. So I'm going to speak in my own personal capacity, and the things I say here today should not be attributed to Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory or NNSA. I'm really speaking in my own capacity. So I'm going to go through.
Oh, Anna, you're on mute now.
I try to switch slides. Okay. So the outline of my presentation, I will talk a little bit about what nuclear posture review documents are, how this process happens, what are the different steps, and then I will get to the details of the Clinton, the Bush, the Obama, and the Trump administration's nuclear posture review documents. And in the end, I will highlight what are the main similarities between these documents, what are the main differences, and then come to my conclusions. So to start off, what is the nuclear posture review document? Every single nuclear posture review document happened in a different historic time, and obviously there were different threats and challenges that the administrations needed to face, and that had an impact on how they were thinking about the role of nuclear weapons. However, in general, what we have seen over the course of the past 20 plus years is that nuclear posture review document defined what's the main role of nuclear weapons, how the different administrations assess the threat environment. These documents outline the nuclear deterrence policy and strategy for the next 5 to 10 years and align the country's nuclear forces accordingly. There were different elements, and also the documents were different in terms of the scope that they looked at, but still in general, these documents outlined the role for nuclear weapons in military planning, the nuclear strategy of the United States, the requirements to maintain a safe, secure, and effective arsenal, deterrence policy, targeting strategy, arms control policy, what is the appropriate mix of nuclear weapons and missile defense capabilities, conventional forces, what are really the drivers of sizing the US nuclear arsenal, what types of warheads are needed to fulfill deterrence requirements. With regards to the history, we had so far 4 nuclear posture review documents. The first one was the Clinton administration's 1994 document. Then the Bush administration prepared its own NPR in 2001. Then the Obama administration in 2010. And the most recent one is the Trump administration's 2018 nuclear posture review. This slide has one purpose only. It is just intended to show that the nuclear posture review is really just the tip of the iceberg, and for people working in the unclassified domain, the nuclear posture review is really the only visible element of how the administration is thinking about the role of nuclear weapons. This is usually available in different formats, sometimes just briefing slides, other times a more substantial write-up of the nuclear posture review was made available for public consumption. But this is really just the beginning of reviewing US nuclear guidance. After the nuclear posture review is prepared, or parallel to the preparation of the nuclear posture review in other cases, the president prepares his or her, so far only his, own employment guidance document, which is really a high-level outline of how the administration, or in what circumstances the administration would even consider the employment of nuclear weapons, in what types of scenarios, and against which specific types of adversaries. After this employment guidance is prepared by the president, this document goes to the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where the OSD guidance describes how to carry out the strategy that was prepared by the president. The next step in the review process is the Joint Chiefs of Staff who implement the guidance by adding detail for military planners. And the last step in the review process is Strategic Command, where Stratcom targeteers and strategic planners produce the employment plan with different options for the president to use nuclear weapons if a decision is made. So just to really drive home, what I wanted to show here is that the nuclear posture review is really just the first step, and the only step that's more or less visible for the general audience, for the allies of the US, and also for the adversaries of the United States. And afterwards, there is really a comprehensive, longer process to actually implement that guidance and reflect it in operational plans. The first nuclear posture review document was prepared by the Clinton administration in 1994. This document was the brainchild of Secretary of Defense Liz Espin, and he worked with Ashton Carter on creating this document. When they decided to conduct a nuclear posture review process, this was really not meant to be a process that will be repeated by every single administration. The Clinton team already prepared a review of conventional forces in the post-Cold War environment. So what the Secretary of Defense decided to do is to have a nuclear review to define how and in what circumstances nuclear weapons continue to play a role in the post-Cold War security environment. This was a bottom-up review process conducted by the Department of Defense. This lasted for about 10 months to prepare the actual document. For the public, the administration only disclosed the short briefing slides and the press release. The scope of the document was mostly focused on force structure decisions and deterrence requirements in the post-Cold War period. The main threats that were relevant for this review process were obviously potential conventional threats emerging from the former Soviet Union, uncertainties about the future of Russia and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and Russian nuclear weapons after the dissolution of the Soviet Union remained in 3 countries, in Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. So handling this situation and figuring out how to dismantle or get those nuclear weapons back to Russia was a very important priority for the Clinton administration. Obviously, there was already a noticeable growing threat of weapons of mass destruction proliferation, and regional competitors were emerging as a more important threat in this post-Cold War environment. The conclusions of the Clinton administration's nuclear posture review pretty much outlined that a smaller role for nuclear weapons will be visible in this new era. As I mentioned, there was a focus on threat reduction efforts, and most importantly in the former Soviet Union, to handle the situation in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. and help them to join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as non-nuclear weapon states. The administration also implemented some force reductions and tried to advance arms control mechanisms and negotiate a new round of strategic arms control. Relaxing the alert posture was another important conclusion of the document, and the administration also decided to retain parity with Russia in nuclear capabilities, maintain commitments for allies, which meant that the forward deployment of US tactical nuclear weapons in Europe will continue, and also the administration emphasized the importance to prevent weapons of mass destruction proliferation. A very important change in the United States was how the administration decided to continue to maintain a safe, secure, and effective nuclear arsenal. In 1992, the Bush administration signed the nuclear testing moratorium, and the Clinton administration extended this testing moratorium and decided that a science-based stockpile stewardship program is going to be the tool that will help to certify the arsenal and maintain safe, secure, and effective future force structure for the United States, which really meant a big scientific undertaking for the national laboratories trying to figure out how they can fulfill this mission without a return to underground testing. The guiding principle of the document was lead but hedge. This was the first nuclear posture review, or the first document in the United States that codified a permanent hedge force for the United States, which served two purposes. First, if there was a technical malfunction in a type of warhead, then the hedge force would be used to bring back weapons that were still functional, or it was also a hedge force to address uncertainties in the security environment, most importantly in the former Soviet space. There were dramatic reductions envisioned by the administration, and they agreed that the United States can fulfill its deterrence mission with a smaller arsenal than any time in the past. And another important priority for the administration was to focus on high standards for nuclear safety and security to prevent unauthorized or unintentional launch of nuclear weapons, and also to strengthen use control by civilians. With regards to the arms control agenda, the START I treaty continued to stay in effect, and the administration negotiated the START II agreement, which the US Senate ratified, and then Russia also ratified, but in response to later on to the Bush administration's decision to withdraw from the ABM treaty, Russia withdrew from START II. However, both sides, both the United States and the Russian Federation, implemented the framework numbers that were included in START II. And the CTBT was also negotiated. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was also negotiated under the Clinton administration. The United States was the first country to sign the treaty, but in 1999, the US Senate rejected ratification of the agreement, so it remains in a political and legal limbo up until today. The next nuclear posture review was the Bush administration's NPR in 2001. This document was mandated by Congress. The brainfather of the document was Keith Payne, and because there was already an ongoing quadrennial defense review process that looked at the non-nuclear elements of the deterrence mix, this had an effect on how the administration was conducting its own nuclear posture review. It had a much broader scope than the previous administration's NPR, and besides the DoD lead here, the DOE and the White House was slightly more engaged than in the case of the Clinton administration. However, it was also conducted largely behind the scenes, and publicly only short briefing slides and the press release was disclosed to the general audience. The scope of the document was very similar to the Clinton administration in terms of focusing on force structure decisions and deterrence needs, but it also included all components of the deterrence mix, not just nuclear, but also non-nuclear offensive strike systems, active and passive defenses, and also focused on the requirements in the infrastructure. So that was definitely a step forward from the Clinton administration's NPR. The main threats that defined how the administration approached the NPR process was, of course, the acknowledgement that the United States faces multiple opponents. This is no longer a bipolar system. There is a new relationship with Russia, and there were growing uncertainties and contingencies coming from the threat of WMD proliferation. And this also meant that the opponents of the United States in the future might not have the capabilities to threaten the mere existence of the US or its allies, but they still had the potential to possess weapons of mass destruction capabilities, which was definitely an issue to be and taken seriously. The conclusions of the document came up with a matrix which defined that the sizing of US nuclear forces will be aligned by 4 priorities: assuring allies, deterring aggressors, dissuading competitors, and defeating enemies. As I mentioned before, this document really tried to create a synergy of nuclear and non-nuclear capabilities, and it maintained the Clinton administration's main scope, which was really focusing on deterrence requirements and modernizations that were needed. However, the document included a lot of innovative concepts and new strategies and elements in the document. One of these new innovations was the concept of a new triad, where the traditional triad of ICBMs, SLBMs, and strategic bombers was only one leg of the new triad, and the other 2 legs were defenses and a responsive infrastructure. On the arms control front, the Bush administration declared that the United States first and foremost needs flexibility, and it does not need to rely on treaty-based approaches to reduce nuclear arms. The United States can do unilateral reductions if it concludes that it can live with a smaller arsenal. There is no need to wait for Russia to negotiate these lengthy and inflexible treaties. So the SORT agreement, or otherwise called the Moscow Treaty, was originally the United States decided that it's going to go down to the 700, 2200 framework numbers that were later on codified in the treaty. And it was President Putin who pushed the United States to codify this unilateral decision in a bilateral treaty. Another important change in operational planning was really creating a true 21st century planning, which meant a stronger focus on adaptive planning for unforeseen contingencies, which also meant that the administration left behind the Cold War concept of single integrated operational plans, or SIOP, and there was a stronger reliance on adaptive planning and really more flexibility in operational planning. This was really a 21st century concept and 21st century document, but the problem was that after Key Spain left office 1 year into the administration, some of these plans were never really materialized. There was no leadership focus on implementing these concepts, and it was also affecting procurement and again the implementation. So many of these innovative concepts never really materialized in the end. The Obama administration conducted its nuclear posture review in 2010. This document, similarly to the Bush administration, was also mandated by Congress, and it was preceded by the Strategic Posture Commission in 2009, which was a bipartisan group of 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats conducting a review and trying to figure out if there was anything they could agree on with regards to the role of nuclear weapons. The Obama administration's nuclear posture review was a truly interagency review. Every single stakeholder was involved in the process. It was still led by DOD, but there was high-level participation from the State Department, from the Department of Energy, from DHS, from the Treasury, from the intelligence community, and very importantly, allies were also kept in the loop the entire time. Their concerns were listened to, and these concerns were channeled into the process. So this was really an interagency process with high-level buy-in from allies. And in the end, there were 4 phases in the review process, and in the end, the White House took the lead in deliberations. This was the first document that was disclosed in a substantial way, a 49 pages long report was issued by the administration. So there was really a substantial write-up that the public was able to look at and really try to see how the administration saw the role of nuclear weapons. With regards to the scope, the document tried to create a delicate balance between the vision of a world without nuclear weapons and maintaining a safe, secure, and effective nuclear arsenal. Ambassador Linton Brooks always says that this was a popular document because it offered something to everyone. So this was really a very clear example of the balancing act between meeting the NPT obligations and Article 6, and also between focusing on maintaining an effective deterrence as long as nuclear weapons remain. This was also the first time that non-proliferation was specifically included in the priorities of the document, and nuclear security also appeared for the very first time in the document. We all know that the Obama administration launched the Nuclear Security Summit series as a follow-up to the NPR document. The main threat that was identified by the administration was the threat of nuclear terrorism and proliferation, which was again a different or a shift in comparison to previous documents. With regards to the conclusions of the Obama NPR, the organizing principle for the relations with Russia and China was strategic stability. This document talked about Russia and China as partners, not as adversaries. There was really a lot of optimism that the United States can constructively work together with Russia and China. This was also the first time that China was elevated up to the level of Russia. Before, in the Bush administration's nuclear posture review, China was grouped together with rogue states, and this was really a shift in how the Obama administration saw the role of China, and this was really the first time that it was elevated to the same level as Russia was handled. The administration also started the strategic stability dialogue, which was really meant to advance cooperation with these two countries. Arms control efforts and non-proliferation efforts were very high on the agenda. The administration had 5 concrete objectives included in the document: preventing proliferation, second, reducing the role of nuclear weapons, third, maintaining effective strategic deterrence at lower nuclear levels, and fourth, strengthening regional deterrence, and fifth, sustain a safe, secure, and effective arsenal. The administration had a lot of doctrinal innovations that really reflected their desire to reduce the role of nuclear weapons. Global Zero was named as a specific long-term goal that Obama also emphasized. It's not going to happen during his lifetime, but it was still a very explicit goal for the long run. He also declared that the use of nuclear weapons would only happen in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the United States, again reflecting a more limited role for nuclear weapons. And the administration also declared that they are going to work towards a sole purpose posture where nuclear weapons would only play a role in nuclear scenarios, and they would no longer play a role in scenarios involving chemical, biological weapons, or conventional weapons. So this was included as a long-term goal. Due to the worries of allies, the administration decided that this was not the right time to take that step to actually implement this doctrine, but it was again identified as a long-term objective. The administration also formulated the most progressive negative security assurance, where they said that non-nuclear weapon states who comply with their NPT obligations will no longer need to worry about the threat or the use of nuclear weapons by the United States. So it was a very positive approach to incentivizing rogue states, telling them that if you come back to compliance with your NPT obligations, then nuclear options are off the table. The administration also considered a no first use declaration, but again, due to the worries of allies, they in the end decided not to implement this doctrine. In the force structure, they retired the nuclear-equipped Tomahawk missiles, and they also decided to unilaterally demurr the ICBMs, although the administration also declared they will maintain a remerving capability. On the arms control front, the New START agreement was the absolute priority, because in December 2009, the first START agreement expired, and it was very important to maintain the verification and transparency mechanisms that the START agreement created. So the New START agreement was agreed on in 2010, and the administration was actually planning to do a follow-on New START agreement with much deeper reductions. However, due to the worsening relations with Russia, this second agreement never materialized. President Obama also declared that he was in strong support of ratifying the CTBT. And also, as we all know, the Iran nuclear deal was another principle that led their nuclear policy. The Trump administration's nuclear posture review was published in 2018. This was also a document that was prepared with an interagency nature. When I talked to people who participated in this review process or review cycle, they confirmed that there was interagency buy-in. However, this document was mostly referenced as a Jim Mattis document. So Secretary of Defense Mattis really took the lead on defining the more nuanced elements of the nuclear posture review. This review was not mandated by Congress. President Trump decided that he will mandate a nuclear posture review process. And similarly to the Obama administration, this document was published. A 75 pages long report was made available for the general public, which was really a high level of transparency, just like in the case of the Obama administration. The scope of the document was mostly returning to the traditional NPR scopes and really looked at deterrence requirements and the ongoing modernization efforts in the United States. To a certain extent, arms control really took a backseat, but part of the reason that the administration returned to this traditional scope was really the dramatic changes of the security environment. The return to great power competition with Russia gave a very different tone to this whole document, and the nuclear posture review starts with a very lengthy review of what is the status of relations with Russia, China, North Korea, and other potential competitors. It had a really dark evaluation of the chances of cooperation and where we go from here. And interestingly, there was practically no mention of the strategic stability dialogue or any measure of cooperation with Russia or China. The main focus was, as I mentioned before, what are the new deterrence requirements that are needed to address the emerging Russia and China threat. After overviewing the security challenges, and again, the four main issues that the nuclear posture review outlined was the Russia threat, the China threat, the North Korea and the Iran threat. The administration decided that there is a big deterrence gap, especially vis-a-vis Russia, and there is a need for new nuclear capabilities. So they decided to include two low-yield capabilities, a low-yield Trident and also a low-yield sea-launched cruise missile in the arsenal. The role of nuclear weapons, it was similar to the Obama administration, that they emphasized that only in extreme circumstances would nuclear weapons be employed. But the administration had absolutely no mention of the sole purpose posture or the no first use declaratory policy argument. It also repeated the negative security assurance that the Obama administration had, but there were more caveats attached to this negative security assurance. They said that there are many scenarios under which the administration would actually reconsider this negative security assurance. On the arms control front, one important new priority for the administration was to focus on a multilateral process, which would, instead of the traditional bilateral US-Russia negotiations, would include in the process China and really try to negotiate in a trilateral format. Chris Ford from the State Department also emphasized at a speech in Brussels that the administration does not necessarily want to rely on treaty-based approaches and negotiated frameworks, maybe normative approaches, less formal agreements between the great powers could actually fulfill the same mission. So there was less of a reliance on negotiated and treaty-based solutions for arms control. And the administration also launched a completely new forum, the Creating the Environment for Nuclear Disarmament, which is intended to facilitate a new type of dialogue about the conditions under which nuclear disarmament could happen. an important aspect of this is that it's really out of the NPT framework, and there are participants in this dialogue who are not participants of the traditional NPT dialogues about disarmament. In the declaratory policy, again, or coming to trying to identify what were the main similarities and what are the main differences between these 4 nuclear posture reviews, we have seen that deciding against a no first use policy was something that every single administration decided was against the interest of the United States, especially under the Obama administration. An important reason for this decision was the arguments of allies and their very strong opposition to a no first use policy. All of these documents also decided against the sole purpose posture, and it was only the Obama administration's nuclear posture review that actually mentioned this concept as a long-term goal for the United States. Maintaining a form of negative security assurance was also a common element in every single NPR. However, the formulation of this negative security assurance was somewhat different, and the Obama administration came really close to almost declaring a negative security assurance without any conditions. The first one was included in the Carter administration in 1979, and there were always different exceptions to the negative security assurance. And as I mentioned, the Obama administration had a rather carrots preference as opposed to sticks, and they really tried to incentivize rogue states to come back to compliance with the NPT, and then nuclear options will be off the table. So that was a different type of approach, but negative security assurance were part of every single administration's nuclear doctrine. There was some level of calculated ambiguity in every single document, and each administration agreed that not defining very clearly under what conditions nuclear weapons would definitely be used serves the interest of the United States. Leaving the option on the table will have a stronger deterrence effect than actually ruling out the use of nuclear weapons in certain scenarios that would involve conventional weapons or other non-nuclear strike capabilities. On the arms control front, the testing moratorium was agreed by every single administration. Again, they had different approaches to the CTBT ratification, but the nuclear testing moratorium was recognized and extended by every single nuclear posture review. And the approach to arms control, even though, again, with regards to the format, there were differences between the administrations, every single NPR recognized that arms control as a principle serves the national interests of the United States, and also, I would add, its allies. On force structure, the main guiding principle for every single document was the rejection of minimum deterrence and maintaining a nuclear triad, and also continuing investments in the modernization of US nuclear forces and their supporting infrastructure. In operational planning, every single administration decided that they will maintain high alert levels for prompt strike response to an attack on the US or its allies and partners. They also decided to maintain open ocean targeting to reduce the risk of inadvertent escalation. Every single administration continued the forward deployment of US nuclear forces in the territory of European allies, and also the goal to better integrate conventional capabilities with nuclear forces was an explicit principle that was included in all of these nuclear posture review documents. What's an interesting addition to this line of argument is between the Obama and the Trump administration's nuclear posture reviews, it was also a similarity that they very explicitly emphasized the need to abide by the laws of armed conflict in nuclear operations. These last two documents were really explicit about that requirement. Coming to the main differences, when we look at how these nuclear posture review documents have been developed, we pretty much have two different frameworks. And the most important elements of comparison or factors of comparison are transparency and the interagency involvement. The first model is how the Clinton administration and the Bush administration run their nuclear posture reviews. These were mostly led by the Department of Defense. These were behind the scenes review processes. The positive aspect of doing a review this way is that it can be done fast, and this is an effective way to run a nuclear posture review. However, The negative aspect of this first model is that these NPRs had a really limited scope on modernization and deterrence, and sometimes they run into serious difficulties of implementation later on because there was no buy-in from the other stakeholders within the US government. The second model that the Obama administration and the Trump administration followed was built on a very strong interagency involvement. As I said, every single stakeholder was included in the development of these nuclear posture review documents. There was a really high level of transparency around these documents and the findings of the nuclear posture review. The positive aspect of running a review like this is that it's easy to get all stakeholders on board when it comes to the implementation of the document. And it's really much better to start including the State Department and other departments from the very beginning, because it will help in the end to create a stronger support for the different innovations that might be included in these nuclear posture reviews, not to mention that also it can support stronger relations with allies if they are kept in the loop during the NPR review process. This, in general, in my opinion, is a more balanced approach, creates a more balanced approach between arms control, deterrence, assurance, and non-proliferation objectives. So it creates really a need for a much larger scope and helps to better align deterrence requirements with other important objectives of US nuclear policy. And the other important differences between these documents was really with regards to arms control policy is really about the format, how these administrations considered to advance the arms control agenda. The Clinton and the Obama administrations were very explicit that they wanted to pursue formal arms control measures, negotiated limits, and legally binding agreements that will reduce nuclear arsenals, versus informal measures that were more favored by the Bush and the Trump administrations, who really had a stronger incentive to maintain flexibility and were actually, I think, more open to the idea of even unilateral reductions if the United States decided that it can live with a smaller arsenal. So again, that connects to the second line here, that the Obama administration was very specific about pursuing arms control negotiations in a reciprocal way with Russia. And when in 2013, President Obama announced that after his review was finished and the presidential employment guidance document was done, the administration concluded that it can live with a 1/3 reduction in deployed strategic nuclear forces. However, the administration did not take this reduction unilaterally. They were waiting for Russia to agree to this reduction, versus, as I mentioned, the Bush administration's example of the SORT agreement, where they were ready to take that reduction unilaterally, and it was really a Russian request that in the end codified this agreement in a legal framework. On the CTBT issue, as I mentioned before, the Clinton and the Obama administrations were very strongly in support of ratifying the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, while the Bush and the Trump administrations extended the nuclear testing moratorium, but they were also very specific that they are not going to pursue ratification of the CTBT agreement. On the declaratory policy, important differences were the different updates to the negative security assurance and under what circumstances the administration would reconsider the negative security assurance. Nuclear terrorism, as I mentioned, was a new element in the Obama and the Trump administration's nuclear posture review. This was previously not included in the Bush and the Clinton NPRs. And strategic stability, again, this was partly justified by the changes in the security environment, but in general, the Clinton and the Obama administration's nuclear posture review had a very cooperative tone towards the major adversaries and tried to advance dialogue and strategic stability vis-a-vis Russia and later on also China, while in the case of the Bush and the Trump administrations, the main guiding principle behind this document was much rather competition and really a focus on deterrence needs. And finally, in force structure, the Obama administration was very specific about not creating new military missions for nuclear weapons and not including new nuclear weapons in the arsenal. I think this was in the public very strongly discussed, and this was a point where the Trump administration's nuclear posture review was heavily criticized for deciding to include two low-yield capabilities in the arsenal. However, just adding to this point for the sake of clarity, when the Obama administration said that no new nuclear weapons will be included in the arsenal, they defined new as something that would not be based on the existing test base. According to this definition by the Obama administration, the Trump administration's two low-yield nuclear weapons would not be considered new either. So just in principle, this debate about new nuclear weapons capabilities has been really in the public domain and has been heavily discussed, but this is just a side note for a more nuanced debate. Coming to the conclusion, and this is my last slide, in the security environment, obviously there were big shifts and there were big differences with regards to the adversaries and the types of scenarios and contingencies that each administration needed to face and address and try to really define the role of nuclear weapons in that given moment in history. So there were obviously, because of the differences in the security environment, there were different approaches and solutions on how to define the role of nuclear weapons and how to look at the arms control agenda. There have been many shifts in focus. However, I still believe that there is a big body of elements in both the declaratory policy, in the force structure, and also in operational planning that showed a very strong level of continuity between all four administrations. In the declaratory policy, for example, refusing no first use policy and maintaining a certain level of calculated ambiguity in nuclear policy was something that every single administration had in common. In force structure, maintaining the triad is a very important continuity between these administrations, and in operational planning, for example, open ocean targeting or a desire for strong conventional nuclear integration was a common theme. So despite the changes in the security environment, despite political affiliations, despite many differences, there were still a lot of guiding principles that were the same, and there is still a big body of strategic elements that show a strong level of continuity between all these four nuclear posture review documents. Thank you so much for your attention.
All right, thank you. So now we're going to move on to the Q&A portion of the team sessions. Just feel free to submit your questions via the live event Q&A chat. You can, again, submit your question anonymously or paste your name in there if you'd like as well. Okay, so our first question is from one of our moderators, Ms. Julie McNally from Stratcom. And the question is, with regard to arms control, what do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of informal and formal arms control measures, and in this context where we have multiple adversaries?
I think that first, I think it's important to highlight that informal measures have been a very important part of the US approach to arms control in the last 20 years. There have been a lot of good examples of informal measures creating a lot of progress. The best example is the presidential nuclear initiatives, which were reciprocal unilateral measures by the George H.W. Bush administration, and the Russian Federation made similar declarations. So unilateral measures, also less formal transparency measures, confidence building measures, moratoriums, freeze declarations have been part of this process for a long time, and they have created a lot of important examples of success stories for us to look at. And obviously, one of the reasons that these informal measures are probably easier to implement is that you don't need to engage in lengthy negotiations. You have way more flexibility. You don't need to argue about the wording of a legally binding document. and therefore this is fast, easy to implement, and also a unilateral declaration by a president does not require congressional consent, which makes it much easier in the case of the United States to avoid an added round of political debate. So it's easier to implement these measures. However, I think the biggest disadvantage of these informal measures is enforcement and verifiability. Obviously, these documents, because they are not legally binding, your measures and your tools to enforce these declarations are way more limited, and there is not much you can do if the other side decides not to fulfill a unilateral declaration. And when we look at the Trump administration's nuclear posture, the paragraph that talks about arms control actually highlights that the two most important aspects of their arms control thinking is enforcement and verifiability. And the problem is that informal measures are very difficult with these two elements. So I think in an environment where you have adversarial relations and your competitors are not likely to cooperate with you, and it's very difficult to negotiate agreements, then informal measures are really good and useful tools as a bridging solution. But in the long run, I think nothing can replace legally binding agreements that can be verified, and that can be, if there's a violation, then obviously there is more options for punishment mechanisms for the aggressor who decided to violate the agreement. So I believe that that we should pursue legally binding agreements, but if the political circumstances are not right, then informal measures can really be a useful tool as a bridging solution.
All right, thank you, Dr. Peczali. So our question now is from John Severns, and the question is, do you believe any no first use declaration by a major power could be considered credible by other nuclear states? And what assurances could be offered that might make it credible?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think when it comes to declaratory policy elements and strategies, policies, the most important caveat we need to start with is that declaratory policy is what it is. If the supreme national interest of a country or one of its allies was at stake, then I don't think a declaratory policy element would keep a president from doing everything that's needed to save an ally or to save its own population. So declaratory policy obviously is what it is, and again, it's a problematic issue with regards to verification and also enforcement. However, I think declaratory policy has been a very important measure to create some level of trust, some level of transparency, and also when you make a declaratory policy like a no first use declaration and say that you do not intend to use nuclear weapons first, and that declaratory policy principle is reflected in your force structure, the way you're posturing your forces, then that actually has a high level of credibility. The example being, for a very long time, China, who has a long-standing no first use declaration. I think for the past 5 years, there is growing uncertainty and a lot of academic debate about to what extent China continues to be abided by its nuclear no first use policy. However, as long as you have a no first use policy, and let's say you keep your nuclear warheads in a storage facility, that really is a clear reflection that you're committed to this policy and you're not intending to use nuclear weapons first. Those nuclear weapons are there as a response option if somebody attacks you first. So there's a number of things you can do in posturing your forces and creating a force structure that is in line with your declaratory policy. And in that case, it will have a high level of credibility, and it can really help to diffuse tensions with your adversaries. However, just making a declaratory policy statement that is not reflected in your modernization efforts, that is not reflected in what is the alert status of your forces, that in itself will probably not have much effect on how your adversaries are preparing to deter you and how your adversaries are reacting to your posture. So it really depends on the synergy between declaratory policy, operational planning, and force structure decisions.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to pair these next two questions together. So the first question is, how useful are nuclear agreements when all nuclear powers, declared and undeclared, are not party to them? And I'll follow that up with the question from Greg Giles from SAIC. And the question is, have NPRs outlived their usefulness?
Let me start with the second one to Greg's question. Our director at CGSR has just authored, I think about a year ago, or maybe less than that, an article that was actually arguing in favor of abandoning, or he called it jettisoning, nuclear posture reviews, making the argument that this stovepipe approach to the different reviews, looking at nuclear weapons in a separate review, then looking at missile defense capabilities in a separate review, and then looking at other different aspects of the strategic toolkit in separate reviews, really makes it difficult to have a comprehensive strategy and to develop something that will reflect this all-domain, cross-domain nature of potential conflict that we are facing in the 21st century. So there has been some academic work and some academic thinking on how these different review processes could be merged into one big review that has a comprehensive approach to every single tool in the strategic toolkit. However, we will see whether if there's a change in the White House in January 2021, we will see whether the administration, the Biden administration, will decide to follow what has been done by the previous administration and keep separate reviews, or they will do something more comprehensive. My take on this is that nuclear posture reviews, again, as I have mentioned at the very beginning, the Clinton administration really did not intend to create a process. That was not their intention. They just wanted to have a comprehensive review on the post-Cold War role of nuclear weapons. Later on, the nuclear posture reviews were mandated by different actors. For the Bush and the Obama administrations, Congress mandated the nuclear posture reviews because they had specific objectives in mind. In the case of the Bush administration, Congress mandated a nuclear posture review because they wanted to get out of funding high-level forces that were prescribed by the First START agreement. Again, under the Obama administration, they wanted to see some level of consolidation. So again, Congress mandated a review process. And in the case of the Trump administration, it was the president who wanted to revisit the nuclear strategy and nuclear policy of the United States because he did not agree with many elements that were included in the Obama NPR. The big question to me with regards to the future is that what will Congress do? If there's a change in the White House, Congress might again in December prescribe a new nuclear posture review that will put the administration on a trajectory where they just need to conduct a separate nuclear posture review. Again, however, I see very strong and good arguments in favor of having a more comprehensive, larger review process that includes every single element of the strategic toolkit. The other question was, how useful are nuclear agreements when all nuclear powers are not party to them? That's a great question. On the non-proliferation front, we really talk about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as the backbone of the global non-proliferation regime, and the NPT is really a success story. If we look at the very limited amount of nuclear proliferators that emerged since the treaty entered into effect in 1970. So the NPT is definitely a success story of a big global agreement that really tries to have every single stakeholder under its umbrella. At the same time, because of the differences in the actual force numbers, currently I think still 92 or 93% of all nuclear capabilities are possessed by the United States and Russia. So I actually see a very important role for bilateral efforts between the US and Russia to continue to reduce nuclear arms and to get closer to their Article 6 commitment, which is a world without nuclear weapons. So I think these two approaches need to work together. There is a very strong incentive still to continue a bilateral dialogue and later on to include China in some kind of way, and also to expand that process to include all nuclear possessors. But but I think that we should not exclude bilateral measures for the sake of having everybody on board all at once. I think this is a gradual step-by-step approach where every single measure has its own positive side and has something to add to the process. And global initiatives like the NPT have proved to be a success, but I think also the bilateral dialogue between the US and Russia has really reduced significantly nuclear arsenals, and hopefully it will continue in the future.
All right, thank you. Our next question is a follow-up to Greg's question, and it's from Julie McNally. And the question is having a review that's nuclear specific in a context where strategic attacks can be non-nuclear in nature sufficient for our needs?
Well, that's exactly part of the reason I think why Brad Roberts was making the argument that the nuclear posture review in itself is not sufficient to address the real security challenges that we are facing today in this 21st century environment. Nuclear posture reviews, as they were done in the past, I think had two additional very important roles in addition to really having an interagency thought exercise where all stakeholders got together, at least in the case of the Obama and the Trump administrations, and really there was a big internal discussion about how do we see nuclear weapons, which in itself, I think the process in itself is highly valuable, having everybody at the table to discuss these issues. But another very important aspect of having a nuclear posture review and conducting it publicly and having a significant write-up of the conclusions in the end was that it really sends a strong message to allies how the US continues to assure them, how the US continues to remain committed to their security. And also it sends a strong message to adversaries and outlines some red lines, sometimes ambiguous, other times very clear red lines, where the administration does not tolerate any kind of aggression. So it really helps to create some measure of transparency. And I think declaratory policy and having a nuclear posture review for these purposes is an important thing. I actually think that many of these positive aspects of having a nuclear posture review would be equally fulfilled by having a more comprehensive review where you look at non-nuclear strategic attack options together with the nuclear toolkit and try to define these synergies or really what integration of conventional and nuclear capabilities means in operational planning. So I definitely see a strong incentive to shift towards a more comprehensive review process. But again, if there will only be a stovepipe look at nuclear, at the role of nuclear weapons, I think it will still fulfill a very important mission that is sending a positive message to allies about the continued US commitment towards their security and also sending some message towards the adversaries and creating some level of transparency about US thinking on nuclear weapons. So if there will be a congressional mandate to conduct a separate nuclear posture review. That would still have some positive aspects to it. However, again, in reflection to this question, I definitely see strong incentives to look at nuclear weapons in a much broader scope with other capabilities.
All right, thank you. And for everyone's situational awareness, Dr. Peczali has agreed to go over by 15 minutes. So we're going to continue with the Q&A since we have some extra questions. So our next question is from Matthew O'Brien from MESA. And the question is, given Russia's pivot to treating attacks launched against them as nuclear attacks, regardless of their capability, how do you see future administrations changing their NPRs?
Russia is definitely the relationship with Russia is, I think, definitely one of the main factors that drive every administration's thinking on their own nuclear posture reviews, and optimism about US-Russia relations was definitely noticeable in the Clinton and the Obama administration's nuclear posture review, and the very pessimistic view of the Russian modernizations and the Russian strategic thinking was definitely noticeable in the Trump administration's review and to a bit lesser extent also in the Bush administration's review. I actually think that if the Obama administration conducted its nuclear posture review today versus 2010, we would see a very different document today from even an Obama administration. So having a way more adversarial relationship with Russia and looking at the modernization efforts they have done in the past few years and they are still undergoing definitely requires a different take. And I think I definitely strongly believe in the balancing act that was that to a certain extent is part of NATO's thinking about deterrence and arms control, but that was also a strong part of the Obama administration's approach to nuclear weapons, balancing between arms control objectives and the NPT Article 6 commitment versus balancing between maintaining a safe, secure arsenal and continue the modernization of nuclear forces. I believe that this balancing act needs to somehow restored in the past few years. My personal feeling has been that there was a very strong focus on deterrence needs. Again, most of it was justified by the changes in the security environment, but arms control has really taken a backseat. So moving on with US-Russia relations, I personally hope to see a more concentrated effort trying to explore what kind of arms control measures could there be that both the US and the Russian Federation would benefit from. And I think there are some areas where there is realistic potential for success. But at the same time, again, I think due to the modernizations that the Russian Federation has done, the so-called exotic new nuclear weapons that they have introduced in their arsenal, definitely justifies also a very strong focus on deterring Russia with effective nuclear forces and also maybe new capabilities within the US. So it will be interesting how, if there's again a change in the White House, how a new administration will approach this question. I think talking to allies has to be a very important aspect of whatever you decide to do and wherever you decide to put the emphasis. Allies in Europe have been very vocal about their perception of the Russia threat in the past few years. And I think any administration that will revisit the role of nuclear weapons has to take into account the perception of allies of the threats they are facing, not just in Europe, obviously in the Asia Pacific as well. So in whatever way the next administration will decide to focus on the Russia threat, I really hope to see a concentrated dialogue or a cooperative dialogue with allies, and we will see where the emphasis will be. I think again, arms control and deterrence has an equal role. You need to balance it according to the requirements of the security environment.
All right, thank you. Our next question is from Maciej Zabrowski from US CENTCOM. And the question is a little bit lengthy, so if you want to take a look at the question. Go ahead. So legally binding solutions sound nice and optimistic. However, the problem is that the US major adversaries like Russia and China don't care as much as we would like them to care about legal obligations. They actually abuse the US trust and good hopes, while at the same time pushing for their own objectives with little regard to legal bindings. VD 2008 war in Georgia, 2014 annexation of Crimea, ongoing war in the east of Ukraine, and the Chinese actions with the Great Rejuvenation. So isn't it much more about us being naive and pushing too many hopes into legal solutions? And this actually proves that in an environment in which adversaries disregard legal bindings, direct bilateral solutions may appear the only successful solutions by almost all means.
That's again an absolutely justified question, and my general optimism about arms control solutions has definitely been significantly undermined by Russian actions in the past few years. We have really seen many treaty violations that the US came out publicly, and we have public record about those accusations with regards to the INF Treaty, as mentioned before, the Budapest Memorandum, the war in Georgia, also the Open Skies Agreement. So there's really a long list of legally binding agreements, but also non-legally binding informal measures like the presidential nuclear initiatives, where the US has publicly accused Russia of being in violation of these agreements. And it's true that this long track record of treaty violations makes it very difficult to negotiate with the Russians, because how can you trust somebody who constantly violates legally binding agreements? And not to mention that it also creates a very big problem for ratifying any kind of legally binding agreement in the US Senate, where there will be obviously very justified arguments against doing so when you cannot trust your partner in that treaty negotiation. So I definitely take to heart all of these justified comments. At the same time, again, I think there are areas where even the current Russian Federation has showed willingness to negotiate legally binding restraints because it serves their national interests. I think one area where there seems to be a strong Russian incentive to have legally binding negotiated limits is deployed strategic nuclear capabilities. It's really not in their interest to lose transparency into what's happening in the United States and the modernization efforts that are being implemented gradually. And also it's not in their interest to start an out-of-control arms race in deployed strategic nuclear capabilities. So despite their long track record of treaty violations, I think there are still areas where you can identify mutual interests, and there is still a good reason to believe that they would comply with their legally binding obligations. And another very important aspect, I think, is with regards to legally binding agreements. It's very visible when they violate an agreement like this, and it's also much easier to gather international support to punish them. So in the case of the INF Treaty, once the US really started to share significant amount of information about the Russian violations, Europeans stood behind the United States, and NATO was together with a unified voice able to condemn the Russian violation of the INF Treaty. And it's now Europeans who are very strongly rejecting the Russian moratorium idea of INF weapons, saying very clearly and critically that why would we engage in a negotiation with a country that already possesses these capabilities and has been lying about it for almost a decade. So when you have a legally binding agreement and you have data and evidence to support that the other side was acting in bad faith and actually violated the legally binding agreement, it's easier to create punishment mechanisms, sanctions against that country, which we have seen after the invasion or the annexation of Crimea. The European Union, but also more broadly, many international actors agreed to sanctions against Russia because they were violating legally binding agreements. So having these norms and commitments in place makes it easier to catch the violator and also to punish them. So I think there is still a continued role for these agreements, again, with some sobering approach on what is possible and what are the areas where the other side is likely to comply, and they might actually see an incentive to play by the rules.
All right, thank you. Our next question is, what are the range of penalties for violators and who enforces vis-a-vis hypersonics?
I think, to the best of my knowledge, again, hypersonic weapons are definitely not the area where I have done any significant research. I don't think there's any legally binding limitation on what the US, Russia, or China can do in hypersonic capabilities. So it makes it difficult to identify what exact types of penalties and in what scenarios he would implement those penalties or sanctions. Again, in general, there are the laws of armed conflict, which give us some guidance on how in an actual war, in an armed conflict, how you should conduct your operations. And in that case, I think there is a gross violation of some of those law principles, then the United Nations would be the natural actor to ask for steps. Again, in the case of the Security Council, obviously, it makes it very difficult if Russia and China decide that you want to punish because they have a veto power in the Security Council. So that significantly restricts the maneuvering capability or the efficacy of what the UN can do in such a scenario. There are some general guiding principles, but again, I'm not familiar with any serious legally binding limitations specifically designed to limit or restrict the use of hypersonic weapons. This might be an area where in the long run the US, Russia, bilaterally or maybe in a trilateral format, including China, might be able to come up with an agreement. And once there is an agreement like that in place, if there's a violation, then the US would probably find it very easy to get the support of the allies and punish the aggressor with the sanctions regime. But until that point, I really find it difficult to identify any kind of penalties against violators, because I don't necessarily see those rules that would be considered as a violation without any kind of legal mechanism other than what we really have in the laws of armed conflict.
Okay, thank you. And we have one last question, and that question is, were Far East allies specifically covered, such as Japan, in the NPR? Yeah,
absolutely. Again, different NPRs had different approach to how to handle the allies, but in the case of the Obama administration's 2010 NPR, that was a really strong cooperation between allies and the US already in the drafting phase of the NPR. And for example, the decision to retire the nuclear-equipped Tomahawk sea-launched cruise missiles was something that was considered to be a crucial capability to reassure allies in the Asia-Pacific. So obviously, when the administration started to explore the option of doing that unilaterally, they channeled in Japan and South Korea and had very lengthy discussions about how that should not be seen as a weakening of US assurances. And allies in the end came on board and accepted this decision, and they were not critical about this decision, which was really because of all that behind the scenes consultation that was happening between the Obama administration and Japan and South Korea. So that was a very good example where allies were really strongly involved in the drafting phase of the NPR. And every single NPR talked about the importance of reassuring allies as one of the main principles, thinking about regional scenarios where obviously US cooperation with allies is a very important aspect of conducting any kind of operation, whether it's in Europe or in the Asia-Pacific. And I think another important aspect of these documents was that each administration decided to continue the forward deployment in Europe. For specifically the Asia-Pacific, I think each administration again confirmed the importance of reassuring allies, but I don't remember lengthy specific discussions about different regions. I think allies in general, that's my impression, has been rather handled in the same bucket, and they were handled together. So I don't recall or I don't remember a specific grouping of Asia-Pacific allies, how we are going to work with them and reassure them versus what we will do with the European allies. Obviously, there are different frameworks there, and NATO conducts its own review of nuclear policy and its own deterrence and defense posture review. So there's a separate review that's happening in coordination with the European allies. But with the Asia-Pacific, I really don't remember specific aspects of these documents. That was really a lengthy, multiple pages long review. These discussions happen in a bilateral framework between the US and South Korea, and between the US and Japan as well.
Okay, well, we've reached the end of today's Microsoft Teams session. So thank you everyone for tuning in today, and thank you, Dr. Peczali, for taking the time to present.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, and also thank you so much for these thoughtful comments and questions. I really enjoyed this session. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.